Remington podcast, where we take a deep dive into all things ammunition. I'm your host, Audrey Mays, and today I'm joined by research engineer Leland.
Nice
Mason
to meet you.
is his last name. And we are going to cover the history of the cartridge from the beginning to modern day.
Not comprehensive, but
Like
the whole kit and caboodle, just like Spark Notes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good
sounds
old Spark Notes. That's how I got through college. So let's start, obviously, at the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. Where you see what were the first signs of like guns and powder in history?
So it's, a lot of the things in the history of guns and ammunition is disputed, right? Because it's a very powerful topic, and a lot of people, say like, oh no, we made it, or like they made it, and like there's dates and people's names that get intertwined, and a lot of that stuff kind of muddies the water. But arguably, the introduction of the most critical component of a firearm, which is the propellant or the powder, in that case the black powder, was the Chinese. And this was the 12th century and 11th or 12th century. And anyway, at that time, the Chinese were believed to use it primarily for like fireworks. And it wasn't something that was used to propel a projectile out of a barrel, right? Mm-hmm. That came, a few centuries later, shortly thereafter, but initially it was fireworks or rockets.
Okay.
So black powder, how they discovered it, a lot of places like Arab nations were developing black powder, resources, and like the main ingredients of black powder at that time as well. And Roger Bacon, actually, who, if you from history class,
I do not know what that is.
So Roger Bacon was a physicist, and in, I think it was the 13th century, he basically was the first recorded writing of the main components as we know today of black powder. Mm-hmm. So the main components of black powder are sulfur, charcoal, and something called saltpeter. Okay. And all of those three components that go together make black powder, and he wrote about it in some manuscript he wrote. He might have been a monk too. He's had a lot of prolific influences in different aspects of history, but he wrote about it back then. So that was the mid 1200s. So it was being used then too. It was known, and he was in England at that time. So you got China, Arab countries, and then England. So it was starting to gain a lot of traction at that time too. So potassium nitrate is what saltpeter is specifically. So that's the technical term. So.
Okay, and then so obviously we have black powder used for not firearms.
Right.
So when did bullets come into play?
So.
I guess they weren't like actual bullets back then.
Kinda. I mean, there was actually there was a monk who was performing some like mixture chemical compound, and this was about that same era, right, mid 1200s, and he mixed the chemicals together essentially to make gunpowder, and compressed them somehow. It's a legend. It's not necessarily,
written in stone.
Right.
Yeah.
But essentially what he was mixing it with exploded and sent shrapnel into the roof. Mm-hmm. And he wrote about in his journal basically that this was a very powerful substance, and it was to be controlled. And he was actually very worried it was going to get out and like be used for the wrong purpose. So anyway.
It wasn't exactly wrong.
Yeah, sure, depending on how you use it. Yeah, and he that was kind of the initial impact of you can use this propellant, or actually black powder is not a propellant. Mm-hmm. It's considered a low explosive to propel projectiles. So we started introducing, and when I say we, I mean the world, started to introduce barrels, right, which was essentially a handheld cannon, right? The stock, the trigger, the fore-end sights, none of that had been invented. It was literally a pipe with a stick on the end of it that people would, put powder in, find a projectile roughly the shape size like a rock, or some sort of semi-manufacturable projectile, and stick it in the barrel and ignite it with the match.
It was pretty archaic, just a way to like control which direction that projectile was going.
And you got to keep in mind, I mean, it's accuracy out of a smooth bore, gun at this, early years in firearms history was not great. This was like as bad as it gets. So like from me to you fighting, right? Like you're mounting a ship, or you're a pirate jumping onto someone's ship trying to, steal their loot, and you're like from me to you. And instead of just reaching out and stabbing them with your sword, you pull out this super heavy, archaic iron contraption. If they were even using iron to make it, probably was bronze and iron probably as well. And trying to blow a massive hole in their chest. So,
right. I mean, like, what are they doing in terms of like trying to light the powder? Just having a match?
Well, that was kind of where, and we probably could transition into talking about the different types of actions.
Yeah, definitely.
So, back then, it was very much, and when I say back then, I'm talking still, 12th, 13th century, like a handheld cannon. So you have like a standalone stick or rod with, all your components in it, and then like a match. Like you've seen people with a cannon, load a cannon with the powder and the cannonball, and then they'll take like a stick and tap the flash hole, and it ignites the powder and then blows the cannonball out. Same thing, right? They had a standalone, two different components they were sticking together.
Right.
Then we started to get fancy and introduced the Matchlock, which was essentially a if you were to look at that, at least compared to what we were previously using, you'd say, okay, that looks like a firearm. And it started to see, you had your stock, a rough shape of a stock, not necessarily sights at the time. Still, we weren't really doing that because, again, it was very close quarters. Towards the end of the Matchlock's life, you started to see the introduction of sights. But it was...
What is a Matchlock?
A Matchlock is a firearm, right at that time, that included a barrel and a flash hole. So you'd tilt your barrel up, pour your powder in, stick your projectile into the barrel, and then you'd take powder and pour it into the pan, or a powder pan.
Right.
And then you have a rope that is doused in like kerosene or something that allows it to smolder, and a stick that when you squeeze the stick, it brings the match, that pinched rope, and touches that pan full of black powder. And that works similarly to what you would expect a flintlock to do when you let the flint or the lock forward.
Hits the flint in a spark.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing, except you're physically like moving a lever to push that rope forward.
So it's not even like a trigger yet. It's still kind of a lever.
It's not really a trigger, but it's getting closer than you having two separate things. So the fancy thing about that is that you've got it all together, right? Arguably, your fire source and your powder.
It's now one mechanism.
Right.
Yeah.
The problem, and on a side note, I'll just say in the gun industry, Ian McCollum from Forgotten Weapons does a fantastic job of talking about the technicalities of this and like analyzing the usage of this. But you've got to keep your match lit.
Right.
When you're running around in the field or whatever on horseback. And you also have to make sure that this lit match doesn't touch your powder on you or the gun when you don't want it to.
Right.
Because if not, and you touch your smoldering match to yourself, now you become
explosive.
Right.
You explode.
Exactly.
Yep.
And then no more fight. Right. You're done. So.
I'm sure there's tons of happenings.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's why we got more development. Right. I mean, otherwise, if it weren't great, we'd still be using matchlocks, which obviously it did not. But so that was super, like archaic compared to what we're using today. Then you went from a matchlock to a few different, very nitty-gritty designs that were slightly different, but the main one that was the biggest step away was called the Snappins, or the Snappins. Okay. So the Snappins is a pseudo flintlock. If you were to look at it, you honestly probably couldn't tell the difference between those two just from a quick glance. And essentially what it is you have a flint on a lock, okay? And you have a trigger now. So when you pull the trigger, you cock your hammer back, your lock.
Right.
You pull your trigger, and that hammer swings forward. It scratches the flint on something called a frizzen.
Okay.
And that sparks, and it sends the spark into the powder pan, and then that ignites your charge.
So you still have a pan.
Still a pan. The Snappin's differs from the Flintlock in that you have to manually uncover the powder. So like whereas typically a Matchlock, you had to set up, you had your target, you had to pour your powder and then touch it at the same time. The Snappin's, you could pour it, close the pan so it's covered.
Yeah.
Run around, and then when you get to your spot, cock the hammer back, open the pan, shoot it.
So we're getting into some convenience and a little bit of safety.
A little safety and a little bit quicker, right, to shoot. Like you don't have to set up as much.
Right.
Right.
You don't have to sit there, take all this stuff out, get ready, and then pull the trigger.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is that time period, right, where your development and all of these things really starts to like you go from like, you know, it's the biggest fundamental changes, and people start to realize like what's important, right? I need to be able to make a quicker shot, and I need to be able to transport all of these together, right? Which, if you think about it, a cartridge firing firearm is the epitome of that.
Portable.
You can transport your ammunition on you, and you can fire it as soon as you get on target, right? Because it's already in the gun, and then you can make quicker follow-up shots. So at this time, we're still troubled or with the problem of quick follow-up shots.
Okay.
Right.
And so, I mean, this brings us into a little bit of like experimentation with how you load the projectile into the firearm.
Yep.
Right. So, like in the 1400s, it changes a little bit. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, you know, specifically in the 1400s, you start to see the introduction of people trying different things with breech loading. And on a side note, I forgot to mention this. So people say you cock your gun.
Yeah.
So the Snappin's, where that term comes from, is like basically in layman's terms a snapping hin. So like if you ever think about like you pull a cock back on or you cock a lever on, or a hammer rather, on a Flintlock or like something like that, and you let it go, it looks like a hen kind of pecking at the ground.
Oh, yeah, I guess it does.
That's where you get a cock, right? Like a hen. And that's where the term Snappin's comes from. So they just attributed that to where it looks like kind of like the beak of a bird or a chicken.
Oh, interesting.
Holding the flint. So that's where that term comes from.
That's a good fun
Everybody's
fact.
like, why do you say cock your gun? That's because of the Snappin's. So
breech loading.
Yep. So breech loading. Same, you know, at this point, that is kind of separate from your actions, where now instead of having to shove everything down through the front of the barrel, the theory is you could open the gun in some way. There's hundreds of different really cool mechanisms and ideas that came about. And, you know, again, this is the mid 1400s, so we're still pretty early at this point.
Right.
But people are trying to make it easier to reload. So instead of having to shove your, at this time, fairly loose-fitting projectile and powder down the barrel from the front, you can stick it in the rear. The problem with that is there were a lot of designs that came about that tried to utilize ways to load multiple chambers at one time.
Okay.
And with black powder especially, and because this powder, even today, if it was smokeless powder, it's not contained. You get a lot of migration. So you'll let's say, for example, you have something that spins and you have barrels pointing outward, right?
Okay.
As you spin, that powder is going to want to touch all the different barrels, and all that action that you spin, all that powder gets everywhere. So you get to a point when your gun gets so dirty, when you ignite the charge that you're intending to ignite, you're probably going to ignite powder around it as well, which at that point you have all of your different charges going off at once, and you have a grenade. So,
in your hand.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
which is not good.
It was problematic.
Yeah.
And, you know, there were definitely better designs than others. A lot of people, like I said, tried some really cool stuff, but it was problematic with a lot of that, those designs just using the loose granules of powder, right? Anyway, alongside of the whole breech loading thing, people were still trying to perfect the mechanism for the action. So you had that Snappin's, then you had the wheel lock. So same thing, ammunition at this point hasn't changed a whole lot, but it's still, this is important because this is what ammunition starts to uncover the importance of having a good action, right?
Okay.
Because a lot of actions are designed around an ammo type, right? Ammo usually comes first, actually.
You would know research and development.
Yeah, that's right. The ammo's the important bit. But anyway, at this point you got the wheel lock, which is kind of similar to a Flintlock, right, or Snappin's, where you wind a wheel up, and when you pull the trigger, the wheel spins and it sparks a flint or of something of sparking material, and then that ignites the powder,
Okay.
right? So it's quicker. You don't have to have a flint. But wheel locks were a little bit more complicated to make. You got to keep in mind there wasn't mass manufacturing at this time. You got people with blacksmithing, talents making this stuff, which some of them are fantastic, but still it's difficult when you have a lot of finely fitting, repeating components. And
That are knocking against each other.
oh yeah, and wearing out and heat treating, all that stuff is very important. So at that point, it was tricky, usually very expensive. A lot of like nobility were the people that would use a wheel lock, for example. But anyway, that was a little bit of an improvement. The biggest and the most founded action that really set the standard for breech loading, or black powder firearms was the Flintlock. The Flintlock, similar to the Snappins, the difference being on a Flintlock, when you let the hammer go forward, it hits the frizzen and covers the powder automatically in the pan, and then it ignites the charge. So Flintlocks were used for a while, and then you started to see a little bit more technology come after that. So.
I mean, I think there's something to say you can still find flintlock guns.
Oh yeah,
around.
Oh yeah, I mean, people use them as hobbies, right? I mean, it's like it's a really there's a lot of people that still like using flintlocks today. I mean, you load it up and set your face on fire, and then have a massive plume of black, sooty black powder smoke come out the end. I mean, it's exhilarating to shoot a flintlock, any of those black powder guns. At this time, you started to see a lot of people make advancements towards the propellant, right? At this time, it wasn't propellant. It is an explosive, but you see people trying to hot rod that.
Okay.
Right?
And what do you mean by hot rod?
So you get to a point when you reach, a certain amount of time or like a mechanical boundary where it's like, I can't get anything else out of this.
Okay.
Like, I've got the most power I'm going to get. I've changed the size of the projectile, the amount of powder, but it's just to a point where I think we've reached the limit. So when these people are hot rodding stuff, they're trying to just bridge the gap a little farther, right, and break that boundary. So the biggest change was the introduction of something called mercury fulminate. So mercury fulminate was intended to be a black powder substitute, but is an explosive itself, but is much more powerful. However, it didn't take off as the main charge for a projectile, but what it did do is it introduced the main component in a percussion cap. So that's kind of the final iteration before you get to
like a primer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you replace that whole lock, flint assembly with the frizzen and all that kind of stuff with a primer, basically, full of this mercury fulminate, and the hammer just hits the primer and sets the powder off that way.
And improvements at this time are also being made on black powder, right? I know that there's something they used to do to black powder called corning.
Yep. So, if you talk to muzzleloader guys today, they still do it. So a lot of muzzleloader guys like making their own black powder. And corning is essentially a process that finely sieves and sorts out your black powder into more desirable components from least desirable components. So corning involves taking your black powder compound, compressing it into pucks, like really tightly fitting pucks, grinding it, and then sieving it so that you separate the larger granules from like a medium granule to like fluff, like
a dust.
The dust.
Yeah.
And the dust is the least desirable of that form because it's just not as efficient in energy delivery.
Okay. It doesn't burn.
It doesn't.
Uniform.
Nope.
Yeah.
And if you don't corn your black powder over time, which is something that they, had problems with back in the day, as you're running around with this powder not being sieved and sorted, it will separate into those components. So your charcoal and your let's see, your charcoal, your potassium nitrate, and your sulfur will separate, and then you don't have black powder. You have a bunch of components in a bag. Mm-hmm. So that's something that they did to make things more consistent. So just think like up at this time, we've got improvements in actions, and then the horsepower right behind all the gas is starting to trim down and be more consistent. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
At this point, it's the early 1800s.
Yep.
We have figured out how to keep our black powder mixture correct.
Yep.
We have now introduced mercury fulminate, which is the beginning stages of primers. Mm-hmm. And we've touched on like different ways to how to load ammunition into a gun.
Yep.
Right. Well, can we touch a little bit on the improvements on a bullet that have come up to this point?
So up until this point, we as the world were primarily just using, either some sort of projectile, like a rock or a roughly round object, to, like a blunderbuss, for example, is like an early shotgun. I've literally read people sticking like forks and knives inside of a barrel and igniting it at close quarters and sending shrapnel towards people, which is pretty wild.
I guess whatever gets the job done.
Yeah. And it's pretty, adverse. Mm-hmm. And then you started to see kind of like not necessarily mass production, but like repeatable production of like spherical projectiles, like a ball, right? Like your Flintlock ball, like, or your black powder ball ammo, right? Or bullet. Really,
when you think like a musket,
you think of a lead ball, right?
Yeah.
And at the point that in some points of history we were casting them into a hand cast mold. They'd pour molten lead in there, let it cool, open it up, and then you have a rough ball. They might sand it a little bit, but it's a consistent shape. You pour that lead in that cast, and you're going to be able to make hundreds of those bullets in that same dimension. Mm-hmm. So you can make a gun more or less of the same caliber that fits fairly tightly. And of course, at this time they were using some rounds were just loose fitting in the barrel. Some of them had patches, right? It's kind of where we get our sabot from today. Like you see that a lot in shotguns. But the biggest change, which you even still see in use today, was the cylindroconoidal bullet.
Good word.
Yeah, it's a fancy word. I was really looking forward to saying that. But the cylindroconoidal bullet is a rounded front with a concave rear. So if you've ever seen a cross section of a rimfire, like a .22 long rifle bullet, right? It's got some sort of rounded profile, some ogive right on it at the front, which we talked about in the handgun episode. But then it has a concave,
like a dip in the bottom.
It's like basically the opposite. And the intent with that is to do what the old round ball wrapped in paper or cloth or some sort of patch did in the barrel, which is to seal off. So we call that in development obdurate.
Obdurate.
Okay. Obdurate. And when you obdurate, you are basically causing that bullet to build up pressure behind it, and because of that concave profile, it flares out and seals off in the barrel, so you don't get gas blow by. It's more efficient, so you don't lose any of your gas or not as much. And it can help with accuracy too. So a little bit of a big improvement. Like I said, we still see that today. The most notable of which is the mini ball, so the French mini ball, which don't underestimate the French in terms of firearms development. So they probably, over the course of everybody, had the biggest changes and improvements to firearms in history. But that French mini ball came later. It was like late 1800s, but it's the same style of bullet. So
as the modern day .22, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. For pretty close. Yeah.
I mean, roughly, right?
Yeah.
So a little bit about again, you talked about shape of bullet, and then you touched briefly on patches, right? And you said paper, which I know that they used well into the 1800s for loading purposes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with certain uses of paper or patches or any of that kind of stuff, you have some people who are, using the older style method. And when I say some people, I mean certain people using a certain type of firearm. There's so many different types of guns being made at this time, different ways of making them, different actions, different barrels, different everything. So there's a lot of different technology going on. And of course, we'll get into it later, but there's one type that really trims everything down, and then you get rid of all that other stuff, right?
They just decide that's the best.
But that, specifically with the paper, right, you have paper cartridges. So this is really kind of the beginning of what we see as the cartridge. So you have still separate bullets, sometimes separate, sometimes together, depending on the firearm. There's been multiples in history of both. But now, instead of having to tip your barrel up, pour your powder in, and then sticking a patched ball down inside of it for your projectile, you have it all in one deal.
And that's what a cartridge is when it's all in one.
But the difference being with that is that was only for transportation. Okay. Typically, in that period, you didn't stick the whole thing down in the barrel. You would have like a cartridge, right? And it would be like a patch full of powder and then a bullet. And you would bite off into the patch, pour the powder in, and then you stick your bullet in there. But that way, you didn't have to have two different things like your powder horn and your satchel of bullets that you're running around in the field with on horseback, jumping around, all this kind of stuff, trying to measure out powder to pour so you don't blow your gun up. It's trimmed that down so that you had measured charges being the key point, which we have today in the Centerfire and Rimfire cartridge. And you had a contained bullet all in one package you could carry around on your person. So that was the biggest thing with that.
So, and then paper cartridges, like you just said, were the first step before we get into metallic cartridges.
Pretty much. Yeah, right about that time, people started to see the tactical advantage of, and keep in mind, a lot of these developments were driven by military use. Right. I mean, you got people out in the field who see the benefit of, hey, now I have a bag full of all my pre-measured cartridges. I would really like to have this for hunting or for recreation or whatnot too, because it's just a better system. So now I can, instead of going to Africa and hunting, or whatnot, where I've got to measure all my stuff out quickly, I can just have that same, analog where I've got contained packages. So all the development focused on, all right, now we need to start really making this cartridge.
Yeah. I mean, you also have, where it would be beneficial, long hunters, hunters that are gone for months, mountain men in America, very famous. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
metallic cartridges.
They, the metallic cartridge really started to surface, not necessarily in the analog we see today with Rimfire and Centerfire, but initially with something called pinfire and then needlefire. So not in that order necessarily. Pinfire cartridges are fairly similar in form to what we know is today is like a Centerfire, but it has a pin sticking up from it, hence the name pinfire. And when you stick it in the gun, you orient the pin in the chamber of the firearm so that the pin protrudes, and when you pull the trigger, a hammer would hit the pin, shove the pin down into the cartridge, ignite a primer, and then that's how you get your cartridge to fire.
But they didn't call it a primer yet.
No. Kind of, yes. They did, but it wasn't separate. You couldn't see it, so it was internal. It wasn't like the same type of analog we have today where it's like you have a cartridge consisting of bullet, propellant, case, primer. It was like you have a cartridge with propellant and some sort of
mix at the bottom.
Ignition system. The problem with the pinfire cartridge is that, they don't sit even. It's not like loose cylinders of cartridges. You have little pins. They can break off or they can set themselves off fairly easy. So they kind of abandoned that and went to, again, the French, coming up with what is arguably one of the first true cartridge loading, pinfire, or this would be a needle fire guns, which is the Chassepots.
Okay.
And basically that, similar, you have a really long needle, looks like a syringe needle in the gun. When you pull the trigger, a needle pierces the soft case and ignites a primer inside of the cartridge up towards the base of the bullet. So it's like total opposite. Like if you were to look at the side profile of a cartridge today, you got going from head, so you got primer, powder, bullet. This is powder, primer, bullet.
Okay.
And it worked okay, but the problem with the pin fire, or needle fire guns, sorry, a lot of fires.
Well, it's almost like a firing pin that we have now.
It is.
Yeah.
It's not, the difference is, and the reason it didn't stick around is because it's just more delicate. So, you know, of course, it's longer, it's thin, it has to be to pierce this cartridge, but also over repeated firings, that needle tended to get brittle and break. So they got rid of that. The Dricey needle gun is another famous example of that. That was probably, arguably, the best version of a needle fire gun, but still didn't quite, you know, hit the head or the nail on the head because just the system is slightly flawed.
Yeah. Not good for wear and tear.
No, no. But I guess at this point in the mid 1800s, right? That was early 1800s. In the mid 1800s, you started to see the rimfire cartridge. So we still have rimfire today. Obviously, primer within the rim and the cartridge. You don't pierce anything. You just deform the rim enough to smash that explosive priming compound to ignite the powder and send the bullet down the barrel. Rimfire, the very first rimfire round was the BB cap. It was like 1845, I believe.
1845.
Yep. And it basically was a percussion cap. So think back to the mercury fulminate percussion cap that we used in a cap lock with a BB, like literally a small round BB shoved into the front of it, no powder, and it was used for gallery shooting. So like really swanky people back in the mid 1800s would have a shooting gallery in their, like, not living room, but in their house.
Like a range in your house.
Yeah, range in your house.
Okay.
And you'd have everybody over dressed in top hats and, you know, all the women in big fancy dresses, and you'd literally shoot these gallery guns with BB caps, and then later the CB cap, which had slightly, a very, very small charge of powder in it at these targets. And there wasn't a lot, it was just a sporting purpose. There wasn't a really big hunting use for it, but that really struck home in that you can translate this to bigger calibers, more powerful. So today, the oldest still current in production cartridge in the world is the 22 short, to my knowledge, and it was like 1874 or something like that. You'd probably correct me on that if I'm wrong, but anyway, that is the oldest of the current cartridges. And same thing, you started to see the introduction of your 22 caliber rimfires. So 22 long rifle came shortly thereafter. There's a couple in between that, of course. This is just not comprehensive, like we said, but. The first repeating firearm, arguably the first repeating firearm that was successful, was the Henry, 1860 Henry. Then it used 44 rimfire, and that was used up through the introduction of the Centerfire cartridge. So, you know, with the Centerfire cartridge, at this point we're, you know, mid to late 1800s.
Yep.
And at that, you start to see the introduction of, you know, what we consider the modern centerfire cartridge that places like Remington makes today. So at this point, we've checked one of the two main boxes, Rimfire, and now we're on Centerfire.
And the big difference, at least in modern Centerfire cartridges, I don't know if it's the same, but this is separation of the primer.
Yep,
from the powder.
that's right.
Yeah.
So now you get those, like we broke down earlier, the whole components. So you got all those, the big four components in a cartridge: bullet powder or bullet propellant, case, and primer. And there were, at the time, experiments like anything with different types of primers. So now, as standard for American manufactured ammunition, we use a boxer primer. So a boxer primer is a primer that has a self-contained anvil. So when you smash the outside primer cup, it imprints on that sharp anvil, and that sharp anvil needs to basically break one crystalline structure of what we use as lead stiffenate.
Okay.
And that's what causes the primer to explode. It's an explosive. It's not a propellant.
That's basically where the spark comes from.
Right.
Okay.
And that spark goes through the flash hole in a boxer primer accepting case, and that ignites the powder. A Berdan primer is different, which there's not a lot of Berdan primer usage in the United States. In certain cartridges that are not necessarily meant to be reloaded based on their use of certain materials, right? Like I know some aluminum cases they still make with Berdan primers because it's not suggested to reload aluminum, right? Things like that. European countries, on the other hand, still sometimes use Berdan primers, and a Berdan primer is where the case is what holds the anvil, and there are usually three little holes that are the flash holes around the outside of the anvil that's built into the case, and that's what breaks it. Interestingly enough, like I said, the Americans typically use boxer primers and Europeans use Berdan primers, but those primer types were actually designed in the exact opposite. So boxers were made in England, and then Berdans were designed in the United States, both by military individuals of each country.
Different military forces. Yeah, that's
kind of
really
weird.
interesting.
Like, don't know why we swapped, but it just kind of worked out that way, I guess.
Yeah,
But
I've actually never seen a Berdan primer before.
kind of weird looking, and a lot of reloaders don't particularly care for them, and that's the big thing is reloading is very popular in the United States because you can't deprime it. If you do, you have to bust through the case and turn it into a boxer primer. It's a little difficult, but
I mean, that's what, when you buy like brass for reloading, it has a primer in it. Oh, yeah. I guess you could buy them separately, but.
Yeah, but you can, but if you have a Berdan case, you can't use a boxer primer. It won't fit. So, but like you said, it's a little weird and not very common, especially over here.
And then, so after primers were kind of established, probably the biggest jump in ammunition manufacturing was in 1884, right when smokeless powder was invented.
Yep. So 1884 is when, again, the French made the Nobel rifle. 8mm Nobel was the cartridge, and it was manufactured using this new fangled smokeless powder. So smokeless powder differs from black powder. Black powder is a low explosive where it detonates, okay? Smokeless powder deflagrates. It doesn't detonate. So deflagrate is a subsonic burning. Okay, if it's supersonic, it turns basically into... There's a few really nitty-gritty, different types of explosives, but for layman's terms, most explosives are considered supersonic to my knowledge, and then subsonics are deflagrating propellants. That's why we don't call powder today, we call it propellant, because it just propels, it doesn't burn, or it doesn't explode. Anyway, smokeless powder is not made of charcoal, sulfur, or saltpeter. It is made of nitric acid and sulfuric acid that is basically mixed into... did I get that right? Yeah. Nitric acid, sulfuric acid mixed into cotton.
Okay.
And it's called gun cotton. Okay. And that is what makes up nitrocellulose. So nitrocellulose is a single base of powder. So like you have something called a single or a double or even a triple base powder. And a single base powder only has nitrocellulose. And like I said, it doesn't explode. A double base powder is mixed with nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin basically hot rods the powder even more. It just makes it a little bit more sensitive at hot and cold temperatures. It's not as stable. Well, you went from the limitations of black powder being it instantaneously explodes, so you have a maximum pressure that you can reach before you start to tear up a gun. And that quick burning is not necessarily conducive to good velocity, right? Because that quick burn means that you're not pushing that thing down the barrel as long.
Right.
Smokeless powder allowed us to use time, right, to build up pressure and slowly, we're still talking about, microseconds, but push a bullet down the barrel.
Would that be dwell time?
That would be dwell time, yeah.
Very nice.
And you get more effective push on the bullet in that dwell time with smokeless powder. So that was the thing we talked about earlier with being the analog that kind of made everything else obsolete.
Right.
Smokeless powder is what we use today to make all of basically the best cartridges. And it just can't be compared. So that was the biggest change, for sure.
40 years later.
Yeah.
We're still using it. 40 years, 140 years.
Yeah. Oh,
later.
and we will be using until people come out with ray guns, right? Which would be awesome. But like a laser gun.
Which would be great.
Yeah.
So a little bit, I have it written down here, so I'm not sure how to make the connection. But you wanted to talk about Alfred Nobel.
So interestingly, which, people may know this. I just thought it was really crazy when I read this as like a kid. I was like, what the heck? Like you hear people talk about Nobel Peace Prizes and stuff like that. Well, Alfred Nobel was an engineer and a chemist, very, very made famous, he was made most famous by his introduction of something called ballastite. Okay. And ballastite was a certain form of, I can't remember the name of the French term for the French mixture and concoction of smokeless powder. It's like collidon or something like that. But anyway, ballastite was supposed to be an improved type of propellant used in cartridges and firearms. And after that, he got his recognition and started to introduce the Nobel Peace Prize. It might have been posthumously, but that is Alfred Nobel. And the reason the Nobel Peace Prize is even a thing is because that guy developed basically a propellant for guns. So like anybody who's, like anti-gun, like gets the Nobel Peace Prize is kind of, ironic, isn't it?
You're welcome,
right?
Alfred.
Yeah. But ballastite was a little bit more powerful than the French concoction. The problem was that it was a little bit unstable as it sat on the shelf. So over shelf life, it became increasingly more unstable, which today we still have smokeless powder. It deteriorates and it breaks down and it turns very reactive to energetics, right? So like if you take a really, really, really old, bad bottle of powder that's, in the middle of and has been deteriorating for some time and you shake it, you can even cause it to ignite that way. That's why you got to be careful. If you're a reloader, watch your powder. Don't keep it out. Don't let it sit out. Keep it controlled.
Dates on it.
Yeah. Don't let it get too old.
Remember when you bought that.
Oh, yeah. And it happens all the time. People, pick up a whole bottle of powder and it heats up. And anyway.
Yeah.
But ballastite was the main reason the British came out with cordite, which cordite, if you've ever seen it, it's really interesting looking. You ought to look up a picture of it. It's basically it's a double base powder. Actually, I believe cordite is a triple base, but it's extruded into tubes by the use of petroleum wax. So when the British entered World War I and World War II even, they were loading the 303 British. Everybody has heard of the 303 British with cordite. So like you'd take the bullet out of the case and pour it out. It looks like spaghetti. Like it's super weird.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And cordite. Is
there a reason for that?
It was just the way that they manufactured it. To my knowledge, it gave them a repeatable way to measure out a certain charge. And cordite was also used, the same formula actually, a lot of the same formulas of cordite were used in a lot of British like artillery shells. So like if you ever look at an artillery shell and you were to look at the propellant, it's literally wraps of cordite.
Interesting.
So like, I know there's a couple pictures on the internet of that. Like it literally looks like a twine wrapped around a bunch of pieces of spaghetti. And that same, analog of charging a cartridge full of propellant was used for large and small caliber ammunition. So anyway, but, after that was made, people started to go back to the powder route because cordite, similarly to ballastite, becomes slightly unstable over time. And it just was determined that even though the British had good intentions and a good idea about metering the powder and their cordite, it still didn't really take off the way that we meter powder today, which is it's just easier to charge a semi-fluid substance like powder than it is to cut strands of cordite, right?
Right, and get it precise. And around the same time, which is the late 1800s, they came out Isn't that when jacketed bullets started coming into the scene?
So jacketed bullets came out right about the same time as the introduction of smokeless powder, and that was almost entirely because of smokeless powder. You generate a lot higher velocities with smokeless powder, and because of that, normal lead bullets and higher powered rifles and such either A, can't hold together internally, so in the barrel, or terminally when they hit their target. So, if you're trying to take a rifle using smokeless powder that was previously using black powder and shoot it at an animal, and you use a solid lead bullet, if you're talking about extremely high velocities like you would be if you were using smokeless powder, it's not necessarily going to hold together. So the jacketed bullet was introduced, and there's a lot of history behind the jacketed bullet as well, which that would probably be a good podcast topic. But,
Stay tuned.
But that came about to help the bullet stay together in the barrel as well as terminally. So that was, kind of in parallel with smokeless powder and the increase in velocity. So, and there's been tons of different technologies with jacketed projectiles. The biggest thing that impacts a consumer, like somebody listening to this podcast today, is the introduction of CIP and SAMI. So CIP was 1914. It was like a couple weeks before the beginning of World War II. And SAMI was, I believe, the mid-20s. And essentially both of those groups, right, organizations, were designed and implemented to better control the manufacture of ammunition and firearms alike. So
you're standardizing it.
You're standardizing it, right? Because previously, and interestingly enough with SAMI, right before SAMI was introduced, there was something like 500 different shotgun shells, like chamberings of shotgun shells on the market, and SAMI completely streamlined that down to, the main ones that we have today, 12 gauge, 20, all that stuff. And that was because there was a couple reasons, but the main reason is that a lot of these cartridges were using similar statistics, similar loads, and similar energies, but they were just called something different.
Right.
So like you'd go buy a gun from one brand and it would be chambered for this specific cartridge that they make. And then another brand makes a different gun, almost the exact same thing with their own cartridge. And it just made it better for the whole purpose as a whole to streamline that and say, okay, no, if you want to make a 12 gauge, make it a 12 gauge, don't make it your own thing. And then that way we can control 12 gauge so that the consumer going to the store who buys a 12 gauge firearm knows that their gun is held to a standard that can safely accept manufactured 12 gauge ammunition, which is held to its own specs. So it's just better for, the industry as a whole. And when you buy Remington ammunition, of course, you're going to have your ammunition held to a SAMI spec. So if you're using our ammo in a modern firearm, it's going to be safe.
So you can shoot 223 Remington in any gun
223
type
Remington. Sure.
that is a 223 Remington.
Absolutely, and that was the intent. And it goes beyond just pressures, right, and velocities. There's suggested accuracy specs. So and a lot of other different details. I mean, even standards for frangibility. Like, if you call something frangible, in order to be SAMI compliant, you have to have a minimum spec met so that you can say it's frangible. So you don't just make something that looks frangible, and then when you shoot it, you're going to get hit with shrapnel, right? So it promotes the better product from ammunition manufacturers and firearm manufacturers alike. So that being applied to all the different technologies is basically where you're buying your ammunition today. It's at least in the current time, the most updated and most controlled and consistent form that it's ever been in history. And probably in history, the most development you've ever seen was like the mid 1800s, right? Especially with smokeless powder and jacketed bullets and, rimfire, centerfire cartridges and all that kind of good stuff. But today, there's still an endless slate of ammunition development that you can do, and we still, of course, work on. So
yeah, I mean, people release new cartridges, new calibers every day.
There's a new use for something, and anybody who says, ammunition engineering or like ammunition development, like, haven't we already figured that out? Well, if that was the case, we'd still be driving Model Ts and living in mud huts, right?
Right, because they did the job, but no one improved on them. Yeah.
Right. Well, there's always room for improvement. So,
And I just think it's crazy going back, like, Remington our founding day was 1816. So we have lived through all
wild?
of this. Yeah, we've lived through it all. We've lived through the development of what a cartridge actually is.
Pretty cool.
And we're still here.
Yep.
So,
that's right.
Yeah. Making ammunition all day.
Yep.
Well, there you have it, guys. Remington is on the rise. Like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to share this podcast with your hunting or shooting buddies. If you have any questions you'd like to ask me or Leland here, you can email us at podcast@remington.com. Thanks for listening.